Welcome, dear listener. As you settle into this quiet moment, let these ancient stories wash over you like a gentle stream. Tonight we journey through tales of loss and discovery, of wandering and homecoming, of God's faithful search for those who have strayed. Let your mind rest as we explore 5 beautiful narratives from Scripture, each one revealing the heart of a God who never stops seeking. Breathe deeply, relax, and let these words carry you into peaceful rest. Throughout the pages of Scripture, a golden thread weaves itself through countless narratives, connecting the hearts of those who wander with the steadfast love of the one who seeks. It is a thread spun from grace, dyed in the colours of redemption, and stretched across the vast landscape of human experience. From the earliest moments of creation, when humanity first turned away in the garden, to the final chapters of Revelation, where all things are made new, we find this persistent theme. God is always searching, always calling, always ready to welcome the lost back home. This theme of being lost and found speaks to something deep within the human soul. We have all known the feeling of being adrift, whether physically separated from loved ones or spiritually distant from our Creator. We understand the ache of absence, the confusion of not knowing which way to turn, the fear that perhaps we have wandered too far to ever find our way back. Yet Scripture offers us story after story that whispers hope into these fears, assuring us that no one is ever beyond the reach of God's searching love. The Bible does not shy away from the reality of lostness. It acknowledges the pain of separation, the consequences of poor choices, the darkness that can envelop us when we stray from the path. But it also proclaims with unwavering certainty that lostness is never the end of the story. There is always the possibility of being found, of returning, of restoration. This is not because of our own ability to navigate our way back, but because we serve a God who leaves the 99 to search for the one, who runs to meet the returning prodigal while he is still a long way off, who never gives up on those he loves. In the stories we will explore tonight, we will meet a variety of characters who experience this divine drama of loss and recovery. Some are objects of great sacred value, like the Ark of the Covenant, which represented God's very presence among his people. Others are individuals who made deliberate choices to walk away, like the younger son in Jesus' famous parable. Still others found themselves lost through circumstances beyond their control, or through the actions of others, like Joseph sold into slavery by his own brothers. Each story is unique, yet all point to the same profound truth. Our God is a God of restoration, a God who delights in bringing the lost back home. As you listen to these narratives unfold, you may find your own story reflected in their details. Perhaps you will recognize moments when you felt hopelessly lost, or times when you experienced the joy of being found. You might recall relationships that seemed broken beyond repair, yet were miraculously restored. Or you may simply find comfort in the reminder that God's love is constant, his patience endless, his arms always open to receive those who return to him. Whatever your personal connection to these themes, know that these are not merely ancient tales from a distant past. They are living words, speaking truth into your present moment, offering hope for your future. The beauty of biblical narratives lies in their layers of meaning. On the surface, we have compelling stories of human drama, complete with conflict, emotion, and resolution. But beneath these surface details, we discover profound theological truths about the nature of God and his relationship with humanity. We learn about grace that cannot be earned, love that will not let us go, and a divine persistence that pursues us even into the far country of our rebellion. These stories teach us not only about God's character, but also about our own nature, our tendency to wander, our deep need for connection, and our capacity for both repentance and redemption. In the ancient world, to be lost often meant to face real danger. A lost sheep could fall prey to wolves or die of exposure. A lost traveller might perish in the wilderness. A lost object of value might never be recovered. The stakes were high and lostness was a serious matter. Yet even in that context, or perhaps especially in that context, the biblical writers chose to emphasize not the danger of being lost, but the joy of being found. They painted pictures of celebration, of feasting, of whole communities rejoicing when what was lost has been recovered. This emphasis reveals something crucial about God's perspective. He does not merely tolerate our return or grudgingly accept us back. He celebrates, he rejoices. He throws a party in heaven over one sinner who repents. These themes of loss and recovery also remind us of the value that God places on each individual. In a world where people can feel like mere numbers in a crowd, forgotten and insignificant, the biblical narratives insist that every single person matters deeply to God. He does not write off the wanderer as a lost cause. He does not dismiss the wayward as unworthy of pursuit. Instead, he goes after each one with the same intensity that a shepherd seeks a lost sheep, or a woman searches for a lost coin. This individualized attention, this personal pursuit, stands as a powerful testimony to human dignity and divine love. As we prepare to enter into these specific stories, it is worth noting that they span different genres and periods of biblical history. We will encounter parables told by Jesus, historical narratives from the books of Samuel and Genesis, and personal correspondence from the Apostle Paul. Despite their diverse origins, these stories harmonize into a unified chorus, all singing the same essential song: God seeks the lost, God restores what is broken, God brings the wanderer home. This consistency across different types of literature and different eras of history suggests that we are touching upon something central to the biblical message, something at the very heart of God's interaction with humanity. The journey we are about to take will lead us through moments of heartbreak and moments of triumph, through scenes of human weakness and displays of divine strength, through the pain of separation and the ecstasy of reunion. We will witness tears of repentance and tears of joy, the shame of those who have strayed and the unconditional acceptance they receive upon return. We will see how God works through ordinary circumstances and extraordinary miracles alike to accomplish his purposes of restoration. And throughout it all, we will be reminded that the God who sought out Adam and Eve in the garden after they hid in shame is the same God who seeks us today, calling our names, inviting us to step out of the shadows and into his loving embrace. So let us begin this journey together, starting with perhaps the most beloved parable ever told, a story that has captured imaginations and touched hearts for 2,000 years. It is a story about a father and two sons, about rebellion and return, about judgment and grace, about a love that defies all human logic and reflects the very heart of heaven itself. In a certain land, in a time not precisely defined, there lived a man of considerable wealth. He owned extensive property, employed many servants, and had built a life of stability and provision through years of careful stewardship. This man had been blessed with two sons, and like any father, he hoped to pass on his legacy to them, to see them prosper and carry forward the family name. The older son had grown into a responsible young man, reliable and dutiful, always present to help with the work of maintaining the estate. He rose early, laboured faithfully, and conducted himself in a manner that brought honour to his father's house. The younger son, however, possessed a different temperament altogether. The younger boy had always been restless, always looking beyond the boundaries of his father's land toward distant horizons. He would stand at the edge of the property and watch travellers passing by on the road, their faces turned toward far-off cities and adventures unknown. While his brother found satisfaction in the rhythms of home and the security of familiar routines, the younger son chafed under these same circumstances, feeling them as constraints rather than comforts. His heart yearned for something more, though he could not have articulated exactly what that something might be. He dreamed of excitement, of freedom, of making his own way in the world without the constant presence of his father's oversight. In his youthful imagination, he convinced himself that true life existed somewhere beyond the gates of home, that happiness awaited him in places he had never seen, among people he had never met. These feelings grew stronger with each passing season, until finally, one day, the younger son came to his father with a request that would have shocked anyone familiar with the customs and expectations of that culture. Standing before his father, he said words that must have pierced the old man's heart like a dagger. He asked for his portion of the inheritance, the share that would normally only come to him upon his father's death. In effect, he was saying to his father that he wished him dead, that he could not wait for the natural order of things to unfold, that he wanted what was his, and he wanted it now. It was a statement of profound disrespect, a rejection not only of his father's authority, but of his very person. Any father in that society would have been well within his rights to refuse such a request, even to punish the son for his audacity. But this father did something unexpected. He did not rage or rebuke. He did not lecture his son on duty and gratitude. Instead, with what we can only imagine was a heartbreaking inside his chest, he granted the request. He divided his property between his two sons, giving each their portion. Perhaps he understood that love cannot be forced, that keeping his son physically present while his heart had already departed would accomplish nothing. Perhaps he knew that some lessons can only be learned through experience, that his younger son needed to discover certain truths for himself. Or perhaps he simply loved his boy too much to chain him to an unwanted life, even though he could foresee the pain that this choice would bring to them both. The younger son wasted no time. Within days he had converted his inheritance into portable wealth, gathered everything he owned, and set off for a distant country. He did not look back as he walked away from his father's house, did not pause to consider what he was leaving behind. His eyes were fixed forward, on the adventure that awaited, on the freedom he had craved for so long. The road stretched before him, leading away from everything familiar, and he walked it with a light step and a lighter heart, convinced that he was finally beginning to truly live. The distant country welcomed him with open arms, as such places always welcome young men with full purses and few questions. He found himself in a city unlike anything he had known, a place of constant motion and endless entertainment, where pleasure could be purchased and no one cared about your family name or your father's reputation. Here he was simply a young man with money to spend, and spend it he did. He made friends easily, or what he thought were friends, people who laughed at his jokes and joined him in his revelries and never seemed to tire of his company as long as the wine kept flowing. Night after night, he feasted at the finest establishments, surrounded by companions who praised his generosity and encouraged his excesses. He bought expensive clothes and rented luxurious accommodations. He tried every pleasure the city had to offer, chasing the happiness he had been so certain awaited him in this far country. For a time, it seemed that his gamble had paid off. Life felt exciting, unlimited, free from the constraints and responsibilities of home. He did not think about his father standing at the gate, watching the road for signs of his return. He did not consider his brother, working double shifts to cover the labour he had abandoned. He thought only of the next party, the next adventure, the next thrill. But money, even a substantial inheritance, does not last forever when spent with such abandon. Gradually, imperceptibly at first, his funds began to dwindle. The pile of coins grew smaller. The weight of his purse grew lighter. Still, he continued spending, unable or unwilling to adjust his lifestyle, telling himself that there was plenty more where that came from, that he would figure something out when the time came. His friends assured him not to worry, that everything would work out, that life was meant to be enjoyed. They had another round of drinks and pushed thoughts of tomorrow aside. Then came the day when he reached into his purse and found it empty. He counted out his remaining coins and realized with growing horror that his inheritance was gone. Every last bit of it had been consumed in pursuit of pleasures that now seemed hollow and meaningless. He went to his friends, the ones who had enjoyed his generosity so freely, hoping for help in his time of need. But these friends suddenly became scarce. They had other engagements, other obligations. Their doors, once so welcoming, were now closed to him. He discovered the painful truth that his companions had been friends with his money, not with his person, and now that the money was gone, so were they. To make matters worse, a severe famine struck the region. Food became scarce and prices soared. The young man found himself not merely broke but truly desperate, facing the very real possibility of starvation. In his hunger and desperation, he sought work, any work that might provide him with enough to survive. But jobs were scarce in the famine, and he had no skills, no connections, no one who cared whether he lived or died. Finally, he found a citizen of that country who was willing to hire him, and he was sent into the fields to feed pigs. For a Jewish young man, this was the ultimate degradation. Pigs were unclean animals, forbidden by the law of Moses. To tend them was to place oneself in a state of ritual impurity, to do work that separated one from the community of God's people. He who had once dined at fine tables now stood in a pig pen, surrounded by mud and filth, watching as the pigs ate their fill of pods while his own stomach cramped with hunger. He looked at the carob pods the pigs were eating, food so unappetizing that normally only animals would consume it, and found himself wishing he could fill his belly with even that. But no one gave him anything. He stood there, empty, exhausted, as far from home as a person could possibly be, not just in miles, but in every way that mattered. It was there, in that pig pen, that something shifted inside him. Standing in the mud, watching pigs eat while he starved, he began to think clearly for perhaps the first time since leaving home. The fog of rebellion and the intoxication of freedom lifted, and he saw his situation with brutal honesty. He thought about his father's house, where even the hired servants had food to spare, bread enough and to spare, while he, the son, was perishing with hunger in a foreign land. The comparison struck him with force. The servants in his father's house, the lowest members of the household, lived better than he was living now. They had shelter, food, security, dignity. He had nothing. In that moment of clarity, he made a decision. He would go back. Not as a son, for he recognized that he had forfeited that right through his actions. He had taken his inheritance and squandered it. He had essentially told his father he wished him dead, then proved through his behavior that he valued his father's wealth more than his father's love. No, he could not return as a son, but perhaps, just perhaps, his father might take him back as a hired servant. It was not much to hope for, but it was something, a path forward when all other paths had led to dead ends. He began to rehearse what he would say. The words formed in his mind, shaped by genuine remorse and desperate need. He would say that he had sinned against heaven and against his father, that he was no longer worthy to be called a son, but that perhaps his father would make him one of his hired servants. These words were true. He had sinned grievously and foolishly. He was not worthy of sonship. But maybe, just maybe, there was a place for him in his father's house, even if only in the servants' quarters. So he rose from the pig pen, shook off as much of the mud as he could, and began the long journey home. Every step was heavy with shame and uncertainty. What if his father refused to see him? What if his brother, the faithful son who had stayed, convinced their father to turn him away? What if he arrived only to find that he had burned that bridge completely, that there was no way back? These fears accompanied him mile after mile, but still he walked on, because what choice did he have? There was nothing for him in the far country. At least at home there was a possibility, however slim, of survival. The road that had seemed so exciting when he first travelled it now felt endless and bleak. He passed landmarks he had barely noticed on his journey away, so eager had he been to leave. Now, hungry and exhausted, he noticed everything. The journey gave him plenty of time to think, to replay his choices, to feel the full weight of his foolishness. He thought about the moment he had asked for his inheritance, the hurt in his father's eyes that he had been too self-absorbed to really see. He thought about the parties, the false friends, the wasted wealth. He thought about the pigs, the hunger, the loneliness. Every memory was painful, but he did not turn away from them. This pain was perhaps the beginning of wisdom, the cost of understanding what he had thrown away. As he drew closer to home, his anxiety grew. What would he find there? How would he be received? He practiced his speech again and again, wanting to get it right, needing his father to understand that he knew he had been wrong, that he was not coming back with demands or expectations, only with hope for mercy. The sun was beginning to set as he finally came within sight of his father's land. He could see the house in the distance, and the sight of it made his throat tighten with emotion. Home. It had always been there, solid and real, while he had been chasing illusions in a far country. What the young man did not know was that every day since his departure, his father had been watching for him. Every evening, the old man would walk to the edge of his property and look down the road, hoping to see a familiar figure approaching. His older son thought this ritual was foolish, a waste of time. The boy had made his choice. He had taken the money and left. He was probably living it up in some foreign city, not giving them a second thought. But the father could not stop watching, could not stop hoping. Love does not give up, does not resign itself to loss, not when there is even the smallest possibility of return. On this particular evening, as the father stood at his usual spot scanning the horizon, he saw something that made his heart leap. There in the distance was a figure walking toward the house. Something about the gait, the set of the shoulders, even at this great distance, struck a chord of recognition. The father stared, hardly daring to believe. Could it be? Was it possible? As the figure drew closer, doubt vanished. It was him. It was his son. His boy was coming home. What happened next would have shocked anyone observing from the older son's perspective. The father, a dignified man of his community, a person of wealth and status, lifted the hem of his robe and began to run. In that culture, men of his age and position simply did not run. It was considered undignified beneath their station. But this father did not care about dignity or propriety. His son, his beloved son whom he had thought might be lost forever, was coming home. Nothing else mattered. He ran down the road, his feet kicking up dust, his breath coming hard, driven by a love that had waited so long for this moment. The younger son saw his father running toward him and stopped, confused. This was not what he had expected. He had expected anger, perhaps, or cold formality. He had prepared himself to be treated as a servant, to grovel and plead. But this? His father running toward him with open arms, with a face full of joy? He barely had time to process it before his father reached him and threw his arms around him, kissing him repeatedly, tears streaming down his weathered face. The son tried to deliver his prepared speech. He managed to get out the words about sinning against heaven and against his father, about being unworthy to be called a son. But before he could finish, before he could get to the part about being made a hired servant, his father was calling to the servants, giving rapid-fire instructions. Bring the best robe quickly and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger. Put sandals on his feet. These were not things given to servants. The best robe was a symbol of honor and status. The ring signified authority and belonging to the family. The sandals marked him as a son, not a barefoot servant. The father was not merely forgiving him or allowing him to work off his debt. He was restoring him fully, completely, without conditions or probationary periods. Then came the ultimate sign of celebration. The father ordered that the fattened calf be killed and prepared for a feast. This animal was not just any livestock, it was a calf that had been specially raised and fattened for some great occasion, reserved for the most important of celebrations. And the father was ordering it killed for a feast to celebrate his lost son's return. He called for music and dancing. He wanted everyone to know that this was a day of profound joy, a day when death had been defeated and life restored, when what was lost had been found. The celebration began with enthusiasm, the house filled with the sounds of music and laughter, the smells of roasting meat and fresh bread. Servants scurried about preparing the feast. Neighbours and friends began to arrive, drawn by the news that had spread quickly through the community. The young man who had left in disgrace had returned and was being honoured with a party. It was unprecedented, scandalous even, but the father did not care what anyone thought. His son was alive. His son was home. That was all that mattered. Meanwhile, the older son had been out in the field, working as he always did, fulfilling his responsibilities with the same steady reliability that had characterized his entire life. As he approached the house as evening fell, he heard the sounds of celebration and wondered what was happening. He called one of the servants over and asked what all this meant. The servant, probably with some hesitation, told him that his brother had come home, and that their father had killed the fattened calf because he had received him back safe and sound. The older son's reaction was immediate and intense. Anger flared up inside him, hot and righteous. He refused to go into the house. All these years he had stayed. All these years he had worked faithfully, never disobeying, never running off to squander money on wild living. And what had he gotten? No party, no fattened calf, no celebration. But his worthless brother, who had disgraced the family and wasted half the estate, comes crawling back and gets the royal treatment. It was unjust. It was wrong. He would not participate in this farce. The father, noticing his older son's absence, came out to find him. He pleaded with him to come in and join the celebration, but the older son let loose with all the resentment that had been building inside him. He pointed out his years of faithful service, his perfect obedience, the fact that his father had never given him even a young goat so he could celebrate with his friends. Yet when this son of his, this waster who had devoured the family's wealth with prostitutes, comes home, the father kills the fattened calf for him. The father's response to this outburst was gentle but firm. He acknowledged his older son's faithful presence, assuring him that everything he had was his, that his place in the family had never been in question. But then he spoke words that cut to the heart of the matter, words that explained everything about this lavish celebration. He said that it was necessary to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of his was dead and is alive again, was lost and is found, dead and alive, lost and found. These were not mere figures of speech. In the father's eyes, his younger son had been as good as dead during all those months and years away. Not knowing where he was, what had become of him, whether he would ever return, the father had lived with a grief as real as if the boy had died. And now, against all hope, he was back. It was like a resurrection, like finding something precious you thought was gone forever. How could they not celebrate? How could joy be contained when life had conquered death, when the lost had been found? The parable, as Jesus told it, ends there, without telling us whether the older brother eventually went in to join the party or continued to sulk outside. This open ending invites reflection. It asks us to consider which son we are, or perhaps to recognize that we carry elements of both within us. Have we known the younger son's rebellion, his squandering of gifts, his journey into a far country of our own making? Or do we identify more with the older son, faithful on the outside but harbouring resentment, serving more from duty than from love, jealous when grace is shown to others? But perhaps the most important question the parable asks is this: do we understand the Father's heart? Do we grasp the extravagant, unreasonable, wonderful nature of the love being portrayed here? This Father does not love based on merit. He does not portion out affection according to achievement. He does not make his wayward son earn his way back into the family. He runs. He embraces. He celebrates. He restores fully and immediately, not because the son deserves it, but because that is what love does. That is who the Father is. This story, told by Jesus to illustrate the character of God, reveals truths that challenge our human notions of fairness and justice. We want people to get what they deserve. We want to see consequences for bad behaviour and rewards for good behaviour. We want the universe to operate on a merit-based system where everything balances out fairly. But God's love does not work that way. It is not fair. It is better than fair. It is grace. It is mercy. It is a father running down the road to embrace a son who deserves nothing but judgment, throwing a party for someone who should by rights be made to work off his debt. And this grace is available to anyone at any time, no matter how far they have strayed or how much they have squandered. The door is always open. The Father is always watching. The robe, the ring, the sandals are ready and waiting. All that is required is that we turn around, that we begin the journey home, that we come to ourselves in whatever pig pen we have ended up in, and remember that there is a Father who loves us. We do not have to clean ourselves up first. We do not have to prove we are worthy. We can come as we are, muddy and ashamed and broken, and we will find arms open to receive us, a voice speaking words of welcome, a celebration prepared in our honour. This is the first and perhaps most foundational story in our exploration of being lost and found, because it establishes the pattern that we will see repeated in different forms throughout the other narratives. God seeks, God waits, God welcomes, God restores, God celebrates. This is not the exception but the rule, not God's reluctant concession but his eager desire, not a backup plan but the very purpose for which Christ came into the world, to seek and to save what was lost. The father in the parable loved both of his sons, but one of them had to travel a difficult road to understand the depth of that love. The other son was in danger of missing it entirely, even while standing in his father's presence, because he had mistaken service for relationship, duty for devotion. Both needed to discover that they were loved not for what they did, but for who they were, sons, beloved and irreplaceable. As we move from this parable into the historical narratives that follow, we carry with us this image of the running father, this picture of grace that knows no bounds. It prepares us to understand the heart of God as it is revealed through the stories of real people in real situations, people who experience in their own lives the truth that Jesus illustrated through this fictional father and his two very different sons. The shepherd counts his sheep as evening falls, a rhythm as old as time itself, watching as they file past him into the safety of the fold. 97, 98, 99. He pauses, counts again. Still 99. One is missing. His heart quickens with concern as he scans the flock, hoping he is miscounted, but the number remains the same. Somewhere out there in the gathering darkness, one of his sheep has not returned. To understand the weight of this moment, we must step back from the parable Jesus told and enter the world of ancient shepherding. These were not hobby farmers tending a few animals on the weekend. Shepherding was life itself, a vocation that required complete dedication, intimate knowledge of each animal, and constant vigilance against the many dangers that threatened the flock. A shepherd's reputation, his livelihood, his very identity was bound up with those sheep. Each one mattered, not just as a financial asset, but as a living creature entrusted to his care. The sheep themselves were far from the clean, white, fluffy creatures we often picture. They were hardy animals, adapted to rough terrain and sparse vegetation, but they were also remarkably foolish in many ways. A sheep could wander off, following some interesting tuft of grass, oblivious to the fact that it was moving away from the safety of the flock. It could get its thick wool caught in thorns or wedged between rocks. It could stumble into a ravine or gully from which it could not escape. It could fall prey to any number of predators that hunted in the wilderness, wolves and lions and bears that saw a lone sheep as an easy meal. Night was falling, and with it came increased danger. Predators hunted primarily at dusk and dawn, using the low light to their advantage. The temperature would drop significantly once the sun set completely. The missing sheep, wherever it was, faced a night of peril. If injured, it might not survive until morning. If trapped somewhere, it could die of exposure or thirst. If being pursued by a predator, well, the outcome was almost certain. Time was of the essence. The shepherd faced a decision. He had 99 sheep safe in the fold. The practical choice would be to secure them for the night and perhaps search for the missing one in the morning, when there would be light to see by and less danger from predators. After all, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one, don't they? Surely it made more sense to protect the 99 than to risk everything for a single foolish sheep that had wandered off. Any reasonable person would understand that choice. It was logical, sensible, prudent. But love is not always logical. The shepherd knew that sheep knew it as an individual. Perhaps it was one prone to wandering, always curious about what lay beyond the next hill. Perhaps it was a young lamb, inexperienced and easily distracted. Perhaps it was an older ewe that had served the flock well for many years. Whatever its particular characteristics, it was his sheep, part of his flock, and he could not simply write it off as an acceptable loss. The thought of it out there alone, frightened, possibly injured, possibly in mortal danger, was unbearable. So he made his choice. He ensured the 99 was secure, with water and shelter, safe from predators behind strong walls or under the watchful eye of another trusted shepherd. Then he gathered what he needed for a search: a staff, a lamp, perhaps some rope and provisions. He turned his face toward the wilderness and began to search, calling out as he went, hoping the sheep would hear his familiar voice and respond. The wilderness at night was a different world from the pastures of day. Shadows pooled in every hollow and crevice. Strange sounds echoed off rocks and through ravines. The wind carried scents that made the shepherd's senses sharpen with wariness. He moved carefully but persistently, checking every place a sheep might have gone. He looked in the thorny thickets where wool might snag. He examined the edges of steep drops where a sheep might have fallen. He searched along the dry stream beds where a thirsty animal might have wandered seeking water. Hours passed. The moon rose and travelled across the sky. Still the shepherd searched, refusing to give up, refusing to go back without the sheep. He called and called, his voice growing hoarse, listening intently for any sound of bleating in response. He thought about that sheep, imagined its fear and confusion. Sheep were flock animals, not meant to be alone. The lone sheep would be terrified, sensing its vulnerability, hearing the night sounds of predators, desperately wanting the safety and companionship of the flock. Then finally he heard it, a weak bleat, barely audible over the sound of the wind. The shepherd turned toward the sound, his heart leaping with hope. He called again, and again came the answering bleat, stronger this time. He pushed through brush and around rocks, following the sound until finally there it was. The sheep was trapped in a narrow crevice between two boulders, unable to back out or move forward, its wool caught on rough stone. It looked up at him with eyes that seemed to express both fear and relief, and it bleated again, a sound that seemed to say, "You came. You actually came for me." The shepherd worked carefully to free the animal, speaking to it in soothing tones, easing it gently from the trap. He examined it by the light of his lamp, checking for injuries, finding some scratches and exhaustion, but nothing life-threatening. The sheep was safe now. It had been found. But the shepherd's work was not finished. The sheep was too weak and frightened to walk all the way back to the fold. So the shepherd did something that demonstrates the full extent of his care. He lifted that sheep, probably not a small animal, and placed it on his shoulders. This was the traditional way shepherds carried sheep that could not walk on their own, draping the animal across the shoulders with its legs held firmly. It was not an easy way to travel, carrying perhaps 60 or 70 pounds of sheep across rough terrain in the dark. But the shepherd did it gladly, feeling the weight as a joy rather than a burden, because this was his sheep and it was found. As he walked back toward home, the sheep secure on his shoulders, the shepherd's heart swelled with a happiness out of all proportion to the circumstances. Yes, he was tired. Yes, the night search had cost him hours of sleep and considerable effort. Yes, he had 99 other sheep who had not caused him any trouble. But none of that mattered in the face of this simple, profound reality. What was lost had been found. The sheep that might have died alone in the wilderness was safe. The flock was complete again. When he arrived back at the fold, he did not simply deposit the sheep and go to sleep. Instead, he called to his friends and neighbours, waking them from their sleep to share his joy. "Rejoice with me," he called out, "for I have found my sheep that was lost." And they did rejoice with him, understanding the significance of this recovery, celebrating a victory over loss that made all the effort worthwhile. Jesus told this parable to make a point, and it is a point that resonates through all the stories we are exploring together. He said that there is more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. This is a startling statement, one that challenges our assumptions about divine mathematics. Surely God cares about all people equally. Surely the faithful 99 matter just as much as the one who wandered off. The parable does not suggest that the 99 matter less. Rather, it highlights the particular joy that comes from recovery and restoration. The 99 are safe and secure, and that is wonderful, but they are not in danger. They are not lost. They do not need to be found. The one who strayed, however, stands on the precipice of disaster. It faces death, destruction, permanent loss. And when it is brought back from that brink, when it is rescued and restored, the joy is particularly intense because the alternative was so terrible. This reflects something deep about the nature of God's love. He does not love in proportions or percentages. He loves each individual with a wholehearted, complete love that would pursue them into any wilderness, search for them through any darkness, carry them home on his shoulders with rejoicing. The shepherd in the parable represents God's relentless pursuit of those who have strayed, his refusal to accept their loss as inevitable, his willingness to go to extraordinary lengths to bring them back. The sheep in the story is notably passive. It does not find its way back on its own. It does not somehow snap out of its foolishness and make an informed decision to return to the flock. It simply bleats from its trap, and the shepherd does all the work of finding, freeing, and carrying it home. This detail is significant because it reminds us that we cannot save ourselves. When we are truly lost, when we are trapped in the consequences of our own poor choices or victimized by circumstances beyond our control, we need someone to come for us. We need a shepherd who knows our voice, who refuses to give up the search, who lifts us onto his shoulders and carries us home. The image of the sheep on the shepherd's shoulders has become iconic in Christian art and literature, and for good reason. It captures something essential about the relationship between God and humanity. We are not self-sufficient. We are not always wise. We have a tendency to wander, to get into trouble, to need rescue. And God, like the Good Shepherd, is always willing to provide that rescue, not because we deserve it, but because that is who he is. He is the God who seeks, who finds, who carries, who celebrates. This parable also speaks to the communal nature of joy in God's kingdom. The shepherd does not keep his happiness to himself. He calls his friends and neighbours to celebrate with him. Similarly, Jesus speaks of joy in heaven, implying a whole community of angels and redeemed souls who rejoice when a lost person is found. Our individual stories of being lost and found are not merely personal transactions between us and God. They are causes for celebration throughout the heavenly realms, sources of joy that ripple outward, touching all who are part of God's family. There is something profoundly comforting in this image of God as a shepherd who pursues us into our lostness. It means that no matter how far we have wandered, no matter how foolish our choices, no matter how trapped we have become in the consequences of our actions, we are not beyond reach. The shepherd is searching. He is calling our name. He is ready to free us from whatever has us trapped, to lift us onto his shoulders, to carry us home. All we need to do is respond to his call, to let him know where we are, to allow ourselves to be found. As we hold this image in our minds, we transition to a very different kind of story, one rooted not in parable, but in historical narrative, one that deals not with a lost sheep, but with a lost sacred object of immense significance. Yet beneath the differences in detail, we will find the same themes of loss, search, and joyful recovery that have characterized all we have explored so far. The Ark of the Covenant was not merely a religious artifact, it was the very throne of God, the place where heaven touched earth, the symbol of God's presence among his people Israel. Crafted according to precise divine specifications in the wilderness after the exodus from Egypt, it was a wooden chest overlaid with pure gold, topped with a mercy seat and 2 golden cherubim whose wings stretched over it. Inside the ark were placed the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments, a jar of manna from the wilderness wanderings, and Aaron's rod that had budded. It represented God's law, his provision, and his chosen priesthood. To be near the ark was to be near the manifest presence of God himself. For generations the ark had travelled with Israel. It went before them in the wilderness, leading the way through the desert. It crossed the Jordan River with them when they entered the Promised Land, and the waters parted before it, just as the Red Sea had parted decades earlier. It was carried around Jericho, and the walls fell. It resided in the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary, where only the high priest could approach it, and even then only once a year on the Day of Atonement, with blood to atone for the sins of the people. The ark was treated with utmost reverence and care because God's presence was not something to be taken lightly. There were strict rules about who could approach it, how it was to be carried, what rituals surrounded its movement. When these rules were ignored or violated, the consequences could be fatal. The ark was powerful, holy, dangerous in the way that all truly sacred things are dangerous to those who approach without proper respect and preparation. But as the years passed and Israel settled in the land, a certain familiarity crept into their relationship with sacred things. The miraculous became routine. The awesome became commonplace. They began to treat the ark almost like a lucky charm, a guaranteed ticket to victory in battle, a magical object whose power could be manipulated for their purposes. They forgot that the ark's power came from the God whose presence it represented, and that God could not be controlled or manipulated. This attitude came to a head during a time when Israel was being oppressed by their enemies, the Philistines. The Philistines were a coastal people, technologically advanced, possessing iron weapons, while Israel still relied primarily on bronze. They had been a thorn in Israel's side for years, raiding their settlements, oppressing them, making life difficult. Finally, Israel decided to confront them in battle. The first battle did not go well for Israel. They were defeated, losing 4,000 men, and retreated in confusion and dismay. The elders gathered to discuss what had gone wrong. They asked the question that showed how far their thinking had drifted from true faith. Why did the Lord allow us to be defeated? What can we do to ensure victory next time? Their answer revealed their spiritual bankruptcy. They decided to bring the Ark of the Covenant from Shiloh, where it resided in the tabernacle, to the battlefield. They reasoned that if the Ark was present, they could not lose, because God's presence would guarantee them victory. They sent messengers to Shiloh, and the Ark was brought to the camp. With it came the two sons of Eli the high priest, Hophni and Phinehas, wicked men who abused their priestly positions and showed contempt for the things of God. When the Ark arrived in the camp, the people raised such a shout of joy and confidence that the earth rang with the sound. They were certain now that victory was assured. The Philistines, hearing this great shout and learning that the Ark had come to the Hebrew camp, were indeed frightened at first. They knew the stories of what this God had done to Egypt, how he had brought plagues and devastation, how he had drowned Pharaoh's army in the sea. But they steeled themselves for battle, preferring to fight and risk defeat rather than become slaves to the Hebrews. The battle was joined, and what happened next was catastrophic for Israel. Not only were they defeated again, they were routed completely. 30,000 Israelite soldiers were killed, including Hophni and Phinehas. And most devastating of all, the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant. They took it as plunder of war, a trophy to display their victory over Israel and Israel's God. When news of the disaster reached Shiloh, the effect was immediate and terrible. A messenger arrived, his clothes torn and dust on his head in signs of mourning, and he brought the awful tidings to Eli the high priest. Eli, now 98 years old and blind, had been sitting by the gate, his heart trembling with worry about the ark. When he heard that his sons were dead, he grieved. But when he heard that the ark of God had been captured, the shock was too much for his aged body. He fell backward off his seat, broke his neck, and died. His daughter-in-law, Phinehas' wife, was pregnant and near her time. When she heard the news that the ark was captured, that her husband and father-in-law were dead, she went into labour. As she was dying in childbirth, the women attending her tried to comfort her, telling her she had given birth to a son, but she would not be comforted. With her last breath she named the child Ichabod, which means the glory has departed, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." The glory had departed. The visible symbol of God's presence was gone, taken by pagans, lost to Israel. It was a theological crisis as much as a military one. If the ark was in enemy hands, did that mean God had abandoned his people? Did it mean the Philistines' gods were stronger than the God of Israel? Had they been forsaken completely? The ark remained in Philistine territory for 7 months, and those months were instructive. The Philistines took the ark to Ashdod and placed it in the temple of their god Dagon, setting it beside Dagon's idol as a tribute to their victory. But the next morning they found Dagon fallen on his face before the ark. They set the idol back up, attributing the fall to some natural cause. But the following morning, Dagon had not only fallen again, but was broken, his head and hands severed and lying on the threshold of the temple. Only his body remained in one piece. The message was clear. The God of Israel would not share his glory with idols. He would not be subordinated to false gods. But God's judgment on the Philistines did not stop with their idol. The people of Ashdod were afflicted with tumors, a plague that spread through their city, causing agony and death. They quickly decided they did not want the ark in their city and sent it to Gath. The same plague broke out in Gath. They sent it to Ekron, and the people of Ekron cried out in terror, not wanting this cursed object in their city. Everywhere the ark went, death and disease followed. The Philistines learned what Israel had forgotten. The ark was not a magical charm to be manipulated, but the representation of a holy God who would not be mocked or controlled. Finally, after 7 months of suffering, the Philistines consulted their priests and diviners about what to do with the ark. The advice was clear: send it back to Israel, and send with it a guilt offering to appease the God who had struck them. They crafted 5 golden tumors and 5 golden rats, representing the plague and the rodents that had apparently been part of their affliction, one for each of the 5 Philistine cities. They placed the ark on a new cart, drawn by 2 milk cows that had never been yoked, whose calves were kept at home. The test was clever. If the cows, acting against their natural instinct to return to their calves, pulled the cart toward Israelite territory, it would be a sign that Israel's God had indeed caused the plagues. If the cows wandered aimlessly or returned home, it was all just coincidence. The cows did not hesitate. They took the straight road to Beth Shemesh, an Israelite town, lowing as they went, as if mourning the separation from their calves, but unable to resist the divine compulsion that drove them forward. The Philistine lords followed at a distance to see what would happen. When the people of Beth Shemesh, who were harvesting wheat in the valley, looked up and saw the ark coming, they rejoiced with great joy. The ark had returned. The glory was coming back to Israel. But even in this moment of joy, the holiness of God could not be ignored. Some of the men of Beth Shemesh, in their curiosity or presumption, looked into the ark, violating its sanctity. 70 men died because of their irreverence. The people were terrified and sent word to the inhabitants of Kiriath Jearim, asking them to come and take the ark. It was brought to the house of Abinadab, and his son Eleazar was consecrated to guard it. And there it remained, largely forgotten, for 20 years. 20 years. An entire generation grew up with the ark sitting in obscurity in a private home, not in the tabernacle where it belonged, not at the center of Israel's worship, but pushed to the side, almost an embarrassment, a reminder of defeat and loss that no one quite knew what to do with. The glory had returned to Israel technically, but it had not been restored to its proper place. The ark was back, but it was still, in a sense, lost. During these 20 years, Israel experienced various trials and challenges. The prophet Samuel led them through a spiritual renewal, calling them to turn from idolatry back to the Lord. They experienced deliverance from Philistine oppression. Eventually they demanded a king, and Saul was anointed to rule over them. Saul's reign began with promise but deteriorated into disobedience and madness. Finally he was killed in battle, and the way was opened for a new king, a man after God's own heart. David was that man. He was anointed king, first over Judah and then over all Israel. He captured Jerusalem from the Jebusites and established it as his capital. He defeated Israel's enemies and consolidated his kingdom. He brought peace and prosperity to the nation. But something was missing. In all his political and military success, David recognized a spiritual vacuum. The Ark of God was still sitting in obscurity in Kiriath Jearim. The presence of God had not been restored to its rightful place at the center of Israel's national life. David understood something that others had forgotten. You cannot separate political success from spiritual faithfulness. You cannot build a kingdom that ignores the God who made the kingdom possible. The ark was not merely a religious relic to be trotted out on special occasions. It represented the presence of the living God, and that presence needed to be central to everything Israel did. So David made a decision. He would bring the ark to Jerusalem. He would restore the glory to its proper place. He would ensure that God's presence was at the very heart of his capital city, his kingdom, his reign. It was a decision born of genuine devotion, a desire to honor God and restore what had been lost, not just physically, but spiritually. David gathered 30,000 chosen men of Israel and went to Baalah of Judah, which was another name for Kiriath Jearim, to bring up the ark. The scene was one of celebration and joy. They set the ark on a new cart, driven by Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, in whose house the ark had resided. David and all Israel celebrated before the Lord with all their might, with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. It was a festive procession, full of music and dancing, as the ark began its journey to Jerusalem. Everything seemed perfect. The lost was being restored. The glory was returning home. But then disaster struck. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, the oxen stumbled. Uzzah, seeing the ark about to fall, reached out his hand to steady it. It seemed like an instinctive reaction, a natural attempt to protect something valuable from damage. But the moment his hand touched the ark, he died. God struck him down for his irreverence, and he fell dead beside the ark. The celebration ceased immediately. David was angry and afraid. He had wanted to do something good, to restore the ark, to honor God, and it had resulted in death. He questioned whether it was even possible to bring the ark to Jerusalem, whether God wanted it there, whether the whole endeavor was cursed. In his fear and confusion, he changed his plans. Instead of continuing to Jerusalem, he turned aside to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, and the ark remained there for 3 months. Those 3 months were a time of reflection and learning for David. He had made a critical error in how he approached moving the ark. He had placed it on a cart, copying what the Philistines had done when they returned it, treating it like ordinary cargo to be transported. But God had given specific instructions for how the ark was to be carried, on the shoulders of the Levites, using poles inserted through rings on its sides, with no one touching the ark itself. David had been so focused on the celebration, on the joy of restoration, that he had neglected the details of obedience. And Uzzah had paid for that neglect with his life. Meanwhile, something interesting was happening at the house of Obed-Edom. The Lord blessed him and his entire household because of the ark's presence. This was reported to David, and it began to change his perspective. The ark was not cursed. God's presence was not something to be feared in itself, but it was something that demanded proper respect, proper approach, proper obedience to God's instructions. David began to study the law, to understand how God had commanded the ark to be handled. He made preparations, consecrating the Levites who would carry it, ensuring that everything would be done according to God's instructions this time. When he was ready, he went again to bring up the ark, but this time with reverence and care, not just enthusiasm and celebration. The Levites carried the ark on their shoulders with the poles, as God had commanded. After they had gone 6 steps, David offered sacrifices of oxen and fat calves, sanctifying the journey, acknowledging God's holiness. And then, in a moment that reveals the depth of David's joy and abandon, he danced before the Lord with all his might. He was wearing a linen ephod, the simple garment of a priest rather than royal robes, having set aside his kingly dignity to worship as an ordinary man before his God. David did not dance with quiet, dignified movements. He leaped and spun with uninhibited joy. The ark was coming home. The presence of God was being restored to its rightful place. All of Israel was bringing up the ark with shouting and with the sound of the horn. It was a moment of pure, ecstatic worship, and David held nothing back. He did not care what he looked like or whether it was appropriate for a king to behave this way. His joy could not be contained. Not everyone appreciated David's display. Michal, his wife and the daughter of the former King Saul, watched from a window as the procession entered Jerusalem. When she saw David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. Later, she would confront him, mocking him for uncovering himself and behaving undignified before the servant girls. But David's response to her criticism was unapologetic. He said he would celebrate before the Lord, and he would become even more undignified than this, humbling himself further, because his worship was for God, not for the approval of others. They brought the ark into Jerusalem and set it in the tent that David had prepared for it in the midst of the city. David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when the sacrifices were complete, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. He distributed food to all the people, to the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins to each one. It was a feast, a celebration, a moment of communal joy at the restoration of what had been lost. The ark had been lost to Israel for years, first captured by enemies, then returned but left in obscurity, forgotten in the corner of a private home. But now it was restored, brought back to the centre of the nation's life, placed in the very heart of Jerusalem where it belonged. The journey had not been easy. There had been setbacks and learning curves, death and fear and uncertainty. But David had persisted, driven by his desire to honour God and restore the divine presence to its proper place. This story of the ark's recovery speaks to us on multiple levels. On one level, it is about the importance of treating sacred things with proper reverence and respect. God is not a tame deity to be approached casually or manipulated for our purposes. He is holy, and holiness demands respect. But on another level, it is about God's desire to be present with his people, to dwell among them, to be at the centre of their lives. The ark in Jerusalem was not for God's benefit, but for Israel's. It was a visible reminder that God was with them, that his presence was real and accessible, that they could approach him through proper channels with confidence that he would hear and respond. David's passionate pursuit of the ark also illustrates the proper response to spiritual loss. When we become aware that God's presence is not central to our lives, that we have pushed him to the margins, that the glory has departed in some sense, the appropriate response is not resignation, but active pursuit of restoration. Like David, we should long for God's presence, make it a priority to bring him back to the centre, be willing to learn how to approach him properly, and celebrate with abandoned joy when restoration is achieved. The contrast between David's first and second attempts to bring the ark to Jerusalem is instructive. The first attempt was characterized by good intentions but poor execution, by enthusiasm without understanding, by celebration without careful attention to God's instructions. It failed. The second attempt was characterized by the same enthusiasm and celebration, but now informed by study and obedience, by proper reverence alongside genuine joy. It succeeded. The lesson is clear. Our zeal for God must be combined with careful attention to how He has told us to approach Him. Good intentions are not enough. We must couple our passion with understanding, our celebration with obedience. And David's uninhibited worship, his willingness to abandon dignity and dance with all his might before the Lord, challenges us to consider our own worship. Are we too concerned with appearances, with maintaining our dignity, with what others might think? Or are we willing, like David, to cast aside our inhibitions and celebrate God with our whole being, holding nothing back? True worship is not about impressing others or maintaining a certain image. It is about expressing our love and gratitude to God in whatever way feels authentic and genuine, even if it makes us look foolish to those who do not understand. The ark found its home in Jerusalem, and there it remained throughout David's reign and into the reign of his son Solomon, who would eventually build a magnificent temple to house it permanently. The glory had been restored. What was lost had been found and brought back to its proper place. And the whole nation rejoiced because the presence of God was with them once again, not hidden away in obscurity, but right there in the heart of their capital, accessible and near. As we move from David's search for the ark to another story of family separation and reunion, we carry with us this understanding. What is lost can be found. What is broken can be restored. What has been pushed to the margins can be brought back to the centre. It requires desire, effort, sometimes painful learning, and always proper reverence. But it is possible, and the joy of restoration makes every difficulty along the way worthwhile. The years had been long for Jacob. He had buried his beloved wife Rachel, watched his sons grow into men, worked his fields and tended his flocks, built a life in Canaan. But there was an ache in his heart that never fully healed, a wound that time could not close. His son Joseph, the favourite of his 12 boys, the child of his old age born to his beloved Rachel, was gone. Dead, he believed, torn apart by a wild animal years ago when he was just 17. Jacob had mourned Joseph as only a father can mourn a cherished child, and though the years passed, the grief remained fresh. What Jacob did not know, what his sons had hidden from him with their lies and their blood-stained coat of many colours, was that Joseph lived. He had not been killed by a wild beast. He had been sold by his own brothers to Midianite traders, who carried him down to Egypt and sold him there as a slave. The brothers had hated Joseph for his dreams, for his father's favouritism, for the special coat Jacob had given him. In their jealousy and rage, they had plotted to kill him, but Reuben, the eldest, had convinced them to throw him in a pit instead, intending to rescue him later. But while Reuben was away, the other brothers saw an opportunity. A caravan of traders was passing by. Why not profit from their hatred? They pulled Joseph from the pit and sold him for 20 pieces of silver. Joseph's journey into Egypt had been one of suffering and perseverance. Sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, he had served faithfully and risen to a position of trust, only to be falsely accused by Potiphar's wife and thrown into prison. In prison, he interpreted dreams for Pharaoh's baker and cupbearer, and though he asked the cupbearer to remember him when he was restored to Pharaoh's service, the man forgot him for 2 full years. But Joseph did not lose faith. He continued to trust in the God of his fathers, believing that even in these dark circumstances there was purpose and plan. Finally, when Pharaoh himself had troubling dreams that none of his magicians or wise men could interpret, the cupbearer remembered Joseph. Joseph was summoned from the prison, cleaned up and dressed properly, and brought before the most powerful man in Egypt. Pharaoh described his dreams. 7 fat cows devoured by 7 lean cows, 7 plump heads of grain consumed by 7 thin heads. Joseph, giving credit to God rather than claiming the interpretation as his own wisdom, explained that the dreams meant 7 years of plenty would be followed by 7 years of severe famine. He advised Pharaoh to appoint someone to oversee the collection and storage of grain during the good years to prepare for the famine to come. Pharaoh was so impressed with Joseph's wisdom that he appointed him to the very position he had described, making him second in command over all Egypt. Only Pharaoh himself would be greater than Joseph. At 30 years old, 13 years after being sold into slavery, Joseph found himself elevated to heights he could never have imagined. He was given Pharaoh's signet ring, dressed in fine linen, adorned with a gold chain, and given an Egyptian name and an Egyptian wife. He rode in Pharaoh's second chariot, and people bowed before him wherever he went. During the 7 years of plenty, Joseph worked tirelessly, travelling throughout Egypt, overseeing the collection and storage of grain in every city. The abundance was so great that eventually they stopped measuring it, for it was beyond counting, like the sand of the sea. Joseph also had 2 sons during this time, Manasseh, whose name meant, "God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house," and Ephraim, meaning, "God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction." These names reflected Joseph's attempt to move forward, to find peace in his new life, even as part of him must have wondered about the family he had left behind. Then the 7 years of plenty ended, and the famine began, just as Joseph had predicted. It was not confined to Egypt, but spread throughout the known world, affecting all the surrounding lands. People from every nation came to Egypt to buy grain, because Joseph had prepared well, and Egypt had food when others did not. Among those affected by the famine was Jacob's family in Canaan. Their supplies ran low, and they faced the very real possibility of starvation. Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt and said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another? I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to Egypt to buy grain. Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's only full brother, the youngest son, and now the favourite since Joseph's supposed death. Jacob was afraid something might happen to Benjamin on the journey, and he could not bear to lose Rachel's other son. The brothers arrived in Egypt and were directed to the official in charge of selling grain. They came before him and bowed down with their faces to the ground, just as Joseph had dreamed so many years ago when he was 17, when he had told them about sheaves of grain bowing to his sheaf, and they had hated him for it. Now, without knowing it, they were fulfilling that very dream, bowing before their brother who held their lives in his hands. Joseph recognized them immediately. How could he not? They were his brothers, the faces that had haunted his dreams during his years of slavery and imprisonment, the voices he could still hear in his memory. But they did not recognize him. Why would they? The last time they saw Joseph, he was a 17-year-old boy in a colourful coat, probably crying and begging as they lowered him into a pit. Now he was a powerful Egyptian official, 39 years old, dressed in Egyptian finery, speaking through an interpreter, wielding absolute authority over the grain supplies of the most powerful nation on earth. The transformation was complete. To them, he was simply a high-ranking Egyptian, and they were desperate foreigners seeking food. Joseph's heart must have been in turmoil. Here were the men who had betrayed him, sold him, caused him years of suffering. Here were his brothers, bowing before him, completely at his mercy. He could have revealed himself immediately. He could have taken revenge. He could have done so many things. But Joseph was not guided by revenge. He wanted something deeper. He wanted to know if they had changed, if they were still the same callous men who had sold their brother, or if the years had brought remorse and transformation. He wanted to see Benjamin, his full brother, and perhaps, though he might not have fully admitted it even to himself, he wanted them to feel some small portion of the fear and helplessness he had felt when they sold him. So Joseph treated them harshly and spoke roughly to them, asking through his interpreter where they came from. They replied that they came from Canaan to buy food. He accused them of being spies, come to see the weakness of the land. They protested that they were honest men, 12 brothers, sons of one man in Canaan, with the youngest still at home and one who was no more. Joseph insisted they were spies and demanded proof of their story. He declared that one of them would remain in prison while the others returned home to bring back their youngest brother. Only then would he believe they were not spies. For 3 days, Joseph kept them all in custody, giving them time to fear and wonder. Then he modified his demand. He said he was a God-fearing man and would give them a chance to prove themselves. One brother would remain imprisoned in Egypt. The rest could return home with grain for their starving families. But they must bring their youngest brother back to Egypt to prove their words were true. If they failed to do so, they would be treated as spies. The brothers conferred among themselves in Hebrew, not knowing that Joseph understood every word they said. They spoke about their guilt concerning Joseph, how they had seen his distress when he pleaded with them, but they had not listened. Now this distress had come upon them as payment for what they had done. Reuben, who had tried to save Joseph, reminded them that he had warned them not to sin against the boy, but they had not listened. Now they were being held accountable for his blood. Joseph had to turn away from them to hide his tears. These words revealed what he needed to know. They felt guilt. They remembered. They connected their current suffering to their past sin. There was at least the beginning of remorse. He composed himself and turned back to them. He took Simeon from among them and bound him before their eyes. Then he gave orders to fill their sacks with grain, to return every man's money to his sack, and to give them provisions for the journey. The brothers loaded their donkeys and departed. When they stopped for the night and one of them opened his sack to give his donkey fodder, he found his money at the top of the sack. He told his brothers, and their hearts sank. They turned trembling to one another, saying, "What is this that God has done to us?" They did not understand what was happening, but they sensed divine judgment in these mysterious events. When they reached their father Jacob in Canaan, they told him everything that had happened, how the Lord of the land had spoken roughly to them, accused them of being spies, demanded they bring Benjamin to prove their honesty, and kept Simeon as a hostage. Then, as they emptied their sacks, every man found his bundle of money in his sack. Both they and their father were afraid when they saw the money. Jacob's response was one of bitter grief and resistance. He said that they had bereaved him of his children. Joseph was no more, Simeon was no more, and now they wanted to take Benjamin. All these things were against him. He refused to let Benjamin go. If harm should happen to him on the journey, Jacob said, they would bring his grey hairs down to Sheol in sorrow. Benjamin was all he had left of Rachel, and he would not risk losing him too. But the famine was severe, and eventually their grain ran out. Jacob told his sons to go back to Egypt and buy more food. Judah reminded him that the man had solemnly warned them they would not see his face unless their brother was with them. If Jacob would send Benjamin, they would go. If not, they would not, because the man had made his conditions clear. Jacob lamented, asking why they had told the man they had another brother. They explained that he had questioned them closely about their family, asking if their father was still alive, if they had another brother. How could they have known he would demand they bring their brother? Judah stepped forward and offered himself as a guarantee for Benjamin's safety. He said to his father, "Send the boy with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and you, and also our little ones. I will be a pledge of his safety. From my hand you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever." This was significant because Judah had been the one who suggested selling Joseph in the first place. Now he was offering to take full responsibility for Benjamin's safety, pledging his own future on it. It was perhaps a sign of how much he had changed. Finally, reluctantly, Jacob agreed. He told them to take double the money, to return the money that had been put back in their sacks in case it was a mistake. He told them to take gifts for the man, some balm, some honey, gum, myrrh, pistachio nuts, and almonds. And he uttered a prayer. "May God Almighty grant you mercy before the man, and may he send back your other brother and Benjamin. If I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved." It was a prayer of resignation, of releasing what he could not control, of trusting God even when he could not see how things would work out. The brothers returned to Egypt with Benjamin. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, his heart leaped. His brother, his mother's other son, the only other child of Rachel, was there before him. He instructed his steward to bring the men to his house and to prepare a feast, for they would eat with him at noon. The steward did as Joseph commanded, but the brothers were afraid when they were brought to Joseph's house. They thought they were being trapped because of the money that had been returned in their sacks. They approached the steward and tried to explain about the money, insisting they had brought it back along with additional money to buy more grain. They did not know who had put the money in their sacks. The steward, who was in on Joseph's plan, reassured them. He told them not to be afraid, that their God and the God of their father must have put treasure in their sacks, for he had received their money. Then he brought Simeon out to them, released from his imprisonment. He brought them into Joseph's house, gave them water to wash their feet, and provided fodder for their donkeys. The brothers prepared their gifts for Joseph's arrival at noon, for they had learned he would eat with them there. When Joseph came home, they presented him with the gifts they had brought, and they bowed down to him, once again fulfilling the dreams that had started all the trouble so many years ago. Joseph asked them about their welfare, about whether their father was well and still alive. They responded that their father was well and was still alive, and they bowed their heads and prostrated themselves. Then Joseph looked up and saw Benjamin, his brother, his mother's son. He asked if this was their youngest brother, the one they had told him about. He said, "God be gracious to you, my son." The emotion was too much for Joseph. He hurried out of the room, seeking a place to weep, for his compassion grew warm for his brother. He went into his chamber and wept there, overcome by the sight of Benjamin, by the realization that his family was before him, by the complexity of feelings that surged through him. When he had composed himself, he washed his face and came out, controlling himself, and ordered that the food be served. They served Joseph separately and the brothers separately, because Egyptians could not eat with Hebrews, as it was an abomination to them. The brothers were seated before Joseph in order of their ages, from the firstborn to the youngest, and they looked at one another in amazement. How could this Egyptian know their birth order? Joseph sent portions to them from his own table, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as any of theirs. They feasted and drank freely with him, though they could not have imagined what was coming next. Joseph was not finished testing his brothers. He commanded his steward to fill the men's sacks with food, as much as they could carry, and to put each man's money back in the mouth of his sack. But in Benjamin's sack, along with his money, the steward was to put Joseph's silver cup, his personal divining cup. The steward did as Joseph commanded. At first light the next morning, the brothers were sent on their way with their donkeys, believing they had successfully completed their mission, and were heading home with food and with both Simeon and Benjamin safe. They had not gone far from the city when Joseph said to his steward, "Go, follow after the men, And when you overtake them, say to them, 'Why have you returned evil for good? Why have you stolen my silver cup? Is it not from this that my Lord drinks, and by this that he practices divination? You have done evil in doing this.' The steward pursued them and overtook them and spoke these words to them. The brothers were shocked. They protested their innocence. Why would their lord speak such words? They had brought back the money they found in their sacks the first time. How then would they steal silver or gold from their lord's house? They were so confident of their innocence that they declared that whichever one of them was found with the cup would die, and the rest would become slaves. The steward agreed to search, but modified their harsh punishment. Only the one with whom the cup was found would be a slave. The rest would be blameless. Each brother quickly lowered his sack to the ground and opened it. The steward searched, beginning with the eldest and ending with the youngest. And the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. The brothers tore their clothes in grief and despair. How could this be? They knew Benjamin had not stolen the cup, but how could they prove it? Who would believe them? They loaded their donkeys again and returned to the city, to Joseph's house. When they came before Joseph, they fell to the ground before him. Joseph asked them what deed they had done, whether they did not know that a man like him could practice divination and discover such things. Judah spoke for them all. He said, "What shall we say to my lord? What shall we speak? Or how can we clear ourselves? God has found out the guilt of your servants. Behold, we are my Lord's servants, both we and he also in whose hand the cup has been found." It was an extraordinary statement. Judah was not just talking about the cup. He was acknowledging a deeper guilt, the guilt they carried for what they had done to Joseph years ago. God had found them out, was holding them accountable, and they accepted it. But Joseph said no. Only the man in whose hand the cup was found would be his servant. The rest could go in peace to their father. This was the ultimate test. Would they abandon Benjamin the way they had abandoned Joseph? Would they save themselves and return to their father with another lie about a lost son? Or had they truly changed? Judah stepped forward. What he said next revealed the depth of his transformation. He approached Joseph and said, "O my lord, please let your servant speak a word in my lord's ears, and let not your anger burn against your servant, for you are like Pharaoh himself." Then he recounted the whole story, how they had told Joseph about their father and their youngest brother, how Joseph had demanded they bring Benjamin, how their father had resisted because he had already lost one son and could not bear to lose another, how he, Judah, had pledged himself as a guarantee for Benjamin's safety. Then Judah made his plea. He explained that if they returned without Benjamin, their father would die of grief. The boy's life was bound up in his father's life. How could Judah go back to his father without the boy? How could he see the evil that would come upon his father? And then came the climax of Judah's speech, the moment that revealed just how much he had changed. "Now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the boy as a servant to my lord, and let the boy go back with his brothers." This was the same Judah who had suggested selling Joseph into slavery to make a profit. Now he was offering to become a slave himself to save Benjamin. The same man who had shown no compassion for his father's grief when they lied about Joseph's death now could not bear the thought of his father's pain if Benjamin did not return. The transformation was complete. Judah had learned to put others before himself, to value his father's heart and his brother's freedom above his own comfort and safety. Joseph could bear it no longer. He could not continue the charade in the face of such genuine repentance and love. He ordered everyone else to leave the room, all his Egyptian attendants and servants. He wanted to be alone with his brothers for what came next. And then, with no one else present, Joseph wept aloud. His weeping was so loud that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" The brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed and terrified at his presence. Joseph called them closer and said again, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt." The words hung in the air, impossible words, world-shattering words. The Egyptian lord was Joseph. Their brother lived. Everything they thought they knew was wrong. Joseph saw their fear and quickly moved to reassure them. He told them not to be distressed or angry with themselves for selling him, because God had sent him ahead of them to preserve life. The famine had been in the land for 2 years, and there were still 5 years to come. God had sent him before them to preserve for them a remnant on earth and to keep alive many survivors. It was not they who sent him to Egypt, but God. God had made him a father to Pharaoh, lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Then Joseph gave them instructions. They were to hurry back to their father and tell him that Joseph was alive, that God had made him lord of all Egypt, and that he should come down to Joseph without delay. Joseph would provide for them in the land of Goshen, where they would be near him. He would provide for them during the remaining 5 years of famine, so that neither they nor their households would come to poverty. He told them to tell their father about all his honor in Egypt and all that they had seen, and to hurry and bring their father down. Then Joseph embraced Benjamin and wept, and Benjamin wept upon his neck. Joseph kissed all his brothers and wept upon them, the years of separation, of pain, of longing all pouring out in those tears. After that his brothers talked with him, the barriers broken down, the relationship beginning to be restored. What had been lost was found. The brother they had betrayed and thought dead was alive. The family that had been fractured was beginning to be made whole again. News of this reached Pharaoh's house, and Pharaoh himself was pleased. He told Joseph to tell his brothers to load their beasts and go to Canaan, to take their father and their households and come to Egypt, where he would give them the best of the land of Egypt, and they would eat the fat of the land. Pharaoh provided them with carts to carry their little ones and their wives and to bring their father. And he told them not to worry about their possessions, for the best of all the land of Egypt would be theirs. Joseph gave them all changes of clothing, but to Benjamin he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 changes of clothing. To his father he sent 10 donkeys loaded with the good things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain, bread, and provision for his father on the journey. He sent his brothers away with a final admonition: do not quarrel on the way. He knew them well enough to know that the journey home would be filled with opportunities for blame and recrimination over their past actions, and he wanted them to move forward in peace rather than in conflict. The brothers made the journey back to Canaan and came to their father Jacob. They told him, "Joseph is still alive, and he is ruler over all the land of Egypt." Jacob's heart became numb, for he did not believe them. How could he? Joseph had been dead for over 20 years. This had to be some cruel joke, some delusion. But they told him all the words of Joseph that he had said to them, and when he saw the carts that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. He said, "It is enough. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." So Israel, as Jacob was also called, set out with all that he had. At Beersheba he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac, and God spoke to him in visions of the night, calling his name. Jacob responded, and God said, "I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes." It was a promise of divine presence, of future hope, and of a final reunion between father and son. Jacob arose from Beersheba, and his sons carried him, their little ones, and their wives in the carts that Pharaoh had sent. They took their livestock and their goods that they had gained in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt, Jacob and all his offspring with him, his sons, his grandsons, his daughters, and his granddaughters. All his offspring he brought with him into Egypt. The family that had been broken, scattered by jealousy and lies and years of separation, was coming together again in a new land, under God's providence. As they neared Egypt, Jacob sent Judah ahead to Joseph to show him the way to Goshen. When they arrived in the land of Goshen, Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to meet his father. As soon as Joseph appeared to him, he fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while, all the tears that had been held back for over 2 decades pouring out in that embrace. Jacob said to Joseph, "Now let me die, since I have seen your face and know that you are still alive." It was the cry of a father who had thought his son dead, who had mourned him for years, who had never expected to see him again. Now, holding his son, knowing he was alive and well and blessed, Jacob felt complete. Whatever happened next, this moment was enough. Joseph settled his father and his brothers in the land of Goshen, as Pharaoh had commanded. He provided for them through the famine, giving them food according to the number of their dependents. The family that had been lost to each other was found. The son who had been sold into slavery had become the means of salvation for his entire family. The brothers who had sinned against Joseph had been forgiven and restored. And the father who had mourned had his son back, alive and thriving beyond anything he could have imagined. The story of Joseph and his brothers is one of the most complete narratives of loss and recovery in all of Scripture. It begins with betrayal and ends with restoration. It includes genuine repentance, tested character, and extravagant forgiveness. Joseph's words to his brothers, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive," capture the theological heart of the story. Even in the midst of human sin and suffering, God was working out his purposes, preserving his people, preparing for the future. For Joseph, being lost meant years of slavery and imprisonment, separation from everything he loved, suffering he did not deserve. But in that lostness, God was shaping him, preparing him for a role he could never have filled without those hard years. The dreams of his youth were fulfilled, but not in the way anyone might have expected. His brothers did bow down to him, but by that time Joseph had learned that leadership is about service and preservation, not about lording power over others. For the brothers, being lost meant living with guilt and shame, carrying the weight of their sin, facing the consequences of their actions in ways they could not have foreseen. Their journey to Egypt for grain became a journey of moral reckoning as they were forced to confront what they had done and who they had become. Being found meant facing their guilt, accepting responsibility, and receiving forgiveness they did not deserve but desperately needed. For Jacob, being lost meant living with grief, believing his beloved son was dead, bearing a pain that never fully healed. Being found meant discovering that what he thought was lost forever had been preserved, that death had not won, that reunion was possible even when all hope seemed gone. His joy at seeing Joseph again was the joy of resurrection, of life-conquering death, of impossible restoration. All of these threads weave together to create a tapestry of God's faithfulness. He was present in Joseph's suffering, giving him favor even in slavery and prison. He was at work in the brothers' repentance, bringing them to the point where they could value others above themselves. He was sustaining Jacob through years of grief, preserving him to see this day of joy. And he was orchestrating events on a grand scale, using a famine and a position of power and family dynamics to preserve not just one family, but entire nations. The story reminds us that being lost and being found are often long processes, not instantaneous events. Joseph's journey from the pit to the palace took over 20 years. The brothers' journey from guilt to forgiveness required multiple trips to Egypt and painful testing. Jacob's journey from grief to joy spanned decades of mourning, but throughout it all, God was faithful, working out his purposes, moving all the pieces into place for the grand reunion that would save so many lives. It also reminds us that being found often involves recognizing and confronting our past. The brothers could not be fully restored until they acknowledged what they had done, until they demonstrated that they had changed, until they were willing to sacrifice themselves for another rather than saving themselves at someone else's expense. True restoration requires truth-telling, repentance, and transformation. And finally, the story shows us that God's purposes are often larger than our individual stories. Joseph was not just saved for his own sake, but to save others. The family was not just reunited for their own happiness, but to preserve the line through which the Messiah would eventually come. Our personal stories of being lost and found fit into God's grand narrative of redemption, and sometimes we do not understand the full significance of our experiences until much later, when we can look back and see how God was weaving everything together for purposes beyond our comprehension. As we move from this epic family saga to another parable Jesus told, we carry with us the understanding that God works in the long term, that restoration is worth waiting for, that forgiveness can heal even the deepest wounds, and that what seems lost forever can be miraculously found when God is at work. The themes continue, the patterns repeat, because we serve a God who specializes in bringing the lost home, no matter how long it takes or how impossible it seems. In a workshop in a humble village, a poor woman lived with very little. She owned just 10 silver coins, her life savings, all that stood between her and destitution. These were not mere pocket change, but valuable coins, possibly part of her dowry or her entire wealth accumulated over years of careful saving. Each coin represented security, future provision, the difference between survival and disaster. She kept them carefully, knowing that in her position she could not afford to lose even one. But one day, as she was going about her daily tasks in her simple home, she discovered with growing horror that one of her 10 coins was missing. She counted again, hoping she had made a mistake, but the number remained the same. 9 coins instead of 10. One was lost somewhere in the house. Panic must have gripped her heart. That coin represented 10% of everything she owned. For someone living on the edge of poverty, such a loss was catastrophic. The house was dim, lit only by whatever sunlight could filter through small windows or doorways. The floor was likely hard-packed earth or rough stone, covered perhaps with a layer of straw or rushes. Searching for a small silver coin in such conditions would be extremely difficult. The coin could have rolled into a crack, been kicked into a corner, or buried itself in the straw. Finding it would require methodical effort and determination. But the woman did not simply accept the loss. She did not tell herself that 9 coins were good enough, that she should be grateful for what remained, that looking for one lost coin was not worth the effort. Instead, she took immediate action. She lit a lamp, even though oil for the lamp was itself a precious commodity that had to be used sparingly. The search for the lost coin was worth the expense of the oil. Then she began to sweep the entire house. This was not a casual once-over, but a thorough, intensive search. She moved furniture, lifted mats, swept every corner, examined every crack in the floor, searched carefully through the straw. She was looking for something small in a space filled with obstacles and shadows, but she did not give up. The value of what she had lost drove her to persist until she found it. We can imagine her working methodically through the house, section by section, moving her lamp to illuminate dark corners, sweeping carefully to avoid scattering the coin if it was hidden in the debris. The search probably took hours. Her back might have ached from bending and searching. Her eyes might have strained from peering into dim spaces. But still she searched, because that coin mattered. It was not expendable. It was essential. And then finally, her diligence was rewarded. The lamplight caught the gleam of silver in a corner, or her sweeping uncovered it from beneath some straw, or it turned up in a crack she had carefully examined. There it was, the lost coin, her lost coin. Relief and joy must have flooded through her in equal measure. What was lost had been found. Her wealth was complete again. The disaster had been averted. But her response to finding the coin shows us something important about the nature of joy. She did not simply pocket the coin and return to her work, relieved but moving on. Instead, she called together her friends and neighbours and said, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I had lost." She threw a celebration. She wanted others to share in her joy, to understand the significance of this recovery, to celebrate with her that what seemed irretrievably lost had been restored. Some might think her celebration was excessive. After all, she found what was already hers. She did not gain anything new, but merely recovered what she had lost. Would the cost of the celebration, the time taken from work, the energy spent on rejoicing, be worth it for a single coin? But such calculations miss the point entirely. The joy was not just about the coin's monetary value, it was about the relief of recovering something precious, about the satisfaction of persistent effort being rewarded, about the completion of what had been incomplete, about wholeness being restored where there had been loss. Jesus told this parable, like the parable of the lost sheep, to illustrate the same truth from a different angle. He said, "Just so, I tell you, there is joy before the angels of God over one sinner who repents." The woman represents God, searching diligently for what is lost. The coin represents a human soul, precious and valuable, whose loss causes distress and whose recovery causes celebration. The parable emphasizes several important truths. First, each individual soul has tremendous value to God. Just as the woman could not be content with 9 coins when she had lost one, God is not content with the saved if even one remains lost. The 99 sheep safely in the fold and the 9 coins safely stored do not diminish the value of the one that is missing. God's mathematics do not work like ours. To him, one lost soul is not a mere statistic or an acceptable loss. It is a precious individual worth every effort to find. Second, God actively searches for the lost. The woman did not wait for the coin to find its way back to her. She did not merely hope it would turn up eventually. She took action, using every resource at her disposal to locate it. Similarly, God does not passively wait for people to find their way to him. He pursues, he seeks, he illuminates darkness, he sweeps away obstacles, he searches diligently until the lost is found. Third, the search requires effort and cost. The woman used expensive lamp oil. She spent time and energy. She worked hard. God's search for the lost likewise comes at a cost. It cost him the life of his Son. It costs the ongoing work of the Holy Spirit. It involves divine patience and persistence. Finding the lost is not easy or cheap, but God considers it worth every cost. Fourth, there is communal celebration when the lost is found. The woman called her friends and neighbours to rejoice with her. Jesus speaks of joy among the angels of God. The recovery of one lost soul is not a private matter, but a cause for heavenly celebration. All of creation has a stake in redemption, and when one person is brought from lostness to foundness, from death to life, from alienation to relationship with God, the joy ripples through the spiritual realms. The parable also highlights an important distinction between the lost sheep and the lost coin. The sheep had some agency in its lostness, having wandered away from the flock. But the coin had no agency at all. It did not choose to be lost. It simply fell, was dropped, was misplaced through no fault of its own. This reminds us that people become lost in different ways. Some wander off deliberately, making choices that lead them away from God. Others find themselves lost through circumstances beyond their control, through the actions of others, through accidents of birth or situation. But regardless of how someone becomes lost, God's response is the same: diligent, persistent, costly search until they are found. The image of God as a woman searching her house is also significant. In a culture where God was often portrayed in masculine terms, Jesus deliberately chose a feminine image for this parable. God is like a shepherd, yes, but also like a woman searching for her lost coin. The character of God encompasses all that is good in both male and female human characteristics, and his love for the lost is as fierce and determined as a mother's love for her child. The coin, unlike the sheep, could not respond to the woman's call. It could not bleat to reveal its location. It was utterly passive, utterly dependent on the woman's search. This speaks to those moments in our spiritual lives when we are so lost that we cannot even cry out for help, when we are buried under the debris of life's circumstances, when we are hidden in dark corners unable to find our way out. Even then, God is searching. Even when we cannot help ourselves, cannot make ourselves known, cannot contribute anything to our own rescue, God's lamp is sweeping over us. His search is methodical and thorough, and he will not give up until we are found. The celebration the woman held when she found her coin demonstrates that the value of something is not just in its monetary worth, but in its significance to the one who holds it. 10 coins were more valuable than 9, not mathematically by a mere 10%, but emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. The completeness mattered. The wholeness mattered. When what is incomplete becomes complete again, when what is broken is made whole, the joy is out of all proportion to mere arithmetic. This same principle applies to God's love for humanity. We are valuable not because of what we can do for God, not because we have achieved some level of worthiness, but simply because we are his. We bear his image. We are his creation. He has invested himself in us, and when even one of us is lost, he searches. When even one is found, heaven celebrates. The parable invites us to see ourselves in multiple roles. We are the coin, sometimes lost through no fault of our own, unable to find our way back, dependent entirely on God's search to recover us. We are also called to be like the woman, searching diligently for those who are lost around us, using our resources to illuminate darkness, sweeping away obstacles, persisting until the lost are found. And we are the friends and neighbours, called to rejoice when the lost are found, to celebrate each story of redemption, to join in the heavenly joy over every sinner who repents. These parables of the lost sheep and the lost coin, told together by Jesus, create a comprehensive picture of God's heart for the lost. He searches like a shepherd in the wilderness. He searches like a woman in her house. He searches in public and in private, in the wild places and in domestic spaces, for those who have wandered and for those who have simply fallen. And when he finds, he celebrates, calling all of heaven to rejoice with him. As we transition now to our final story, we move from parables to a piece of personal correspondence, a letter written by the Apostle Paul to a man named Philemon. It is a short letter, easily read in a few minutes, but it contains depths of meaning about loss, recovery, transformation, and restoration. It is about a runaway slave who became lost and was found, about relationships broken and relationships restored, about how the gospel transforms everything it touches. In the ancient Roman world, slavery was ubiquitous. It was the foundation of the economy, an accepted part of social structure. Slaves were property, with no legal rights, subject to the absolute authority of their masters. They could be bought, sold, used, abused, or killed at their master's whim. Slavery in that context was nothing like modern employment. It was total ownership of one person by another. Among the believers in Colossae, a city in Asia Minor, was a man named Philemon. He was a Christian, apparently a person of some wealth and standing, for he owned slaves and had a house large enough to host a church. Paul the Apostle had led him to faith in Christ, and they shared a deep friendship and partnership in the gospel. Philemon was known for his love and faith, for refreshing the hearts of the saints, for being a genuine follower of Jesus who took his faith seriously. One of Philemon's slaves was named Onesimus, a name that meant useful. We do not know exactly what Onesimus did in Philemon's household or how long he had served there. But at some point, Onesimus did something that would have been considered one of the worst crimes a slave could commit. He ran away. Moreover, there is a hint in Paul's letter that he may have stolen from Philemon before he fled, taking money or property to fund his escape. For a slave to run away was to risk everything. If caught, the punishment could be severe: branding, flogging, being sent to work in the mines, or even execution. The Roman world had no sympathy for runaway slaves. They were considered criminals, threats to social order, examples to be made of. Onesimus fled anyway, perhaps driven by desperation, by harsh treatment, by dreams of freedom, or by some combination of circumstances we can no longer know. Somehow, Onesimus ended up in Rome, over 1,000 miles from Colossae. Perhaps he thought that in the vast anonymity of the empire's capital city, he could disappear, start a new life, never be found. Rome was a city of over 1 million people, filled with the displaced and the desperate, a place where a runaway slave might hope to blend in and avoid detection. But God's providence works in mysterious ways. In Rome, Onesimus encountered the Apostle Paul. We do not know exactly how they met. Paul was in Rome under house arrest, awaiting trial, but he was allowed to receive visitors and continued his ministry even in chains. Perhaps Onesimus heard Paul preaching. Perhaps someone brought him to Paul. Perhaps Onesimus, knowing that Paul was Philemon's friend, sought him out for reasons we can only guess at. Whatever the circumstances of their meeting, something profound happened. Paul shared the gospel with Onesimus, and Onesimus believed. The runaway slave became a brother in Christ. The useful servant who had become useless to his earthly master became useful in the service of the gospel. Paul grew to love Onesimus, finding in him a true helper and companion during his imprisonment. Onesimus proved himself in his service to Paul. He was helpful, faithful, refreshing to Paul's heart, just as Philemon had been refreshing to the hearts of the saints. Paul even says in his letter that he would have liked to keep Onesimus with him, so that Onesimus could serve him on Philemon's behalf while Paul was in chains for the gospel. The transformation in Onesimus was real and profound. He had been lost in multiple senses, lost as a runaway slave, lost in sin, lost far from home, and had been found. But there was a problem. Onesimus was still legally Philemon's slave. By the law of the land, he was a fugitive, a criminal, stolen property that needed to be returned. Paul could not simply keep him in Rome, no matter how useful he was. The matter needed to be addressed. Onesimus needed to be reconciled to Philemon, and the relationship needed to be restored on a new foundation. So Paul made a decision. He would send Onesimus back to Philemon, but not empty-handed and not without support. He would write a letter to Philemon, a letter that would accompany Onesimus on his return journey, a letter that would plead Onesimus's case and ask Philemon to receive him back not as a slave but as a beloved brother. The letter Paul wrote is a masterpiece of pastoral wisdom and rhetorical skill. He begins by affirming Philemon's faith and love by expressing his joy and comfort in Philemon's character. He establishes the relationship, reminding Philemon of their bond in Christ, of how Paul had been instrumental in Philemon's conversion. Then Paul gets to the matter at hand. He tells Philemon that he is appealing to him on the basis of love rather than commanding him by apostolic authority, even though he could. He describes himself as Paul, an old man and now a prisoner for Christ Jesus, to evoke sympathy and remind Philemon of Paul's suffering for the gospel. Then he introduces the subject of his appeal. Onesimus, whom Paul calls my child, whom I have fathered in my imprisonment. Paul acknowledges the irony of the situation with a play on words. Onesimus's name meant useful, but Paul says that formerly he was useless to Philemon. Now, however, he is indeed useful both to Philemon and to Paul. The useless has become useful. The one who was unprofitable has become profitable. It is a transformation that echoes the transformation the gospel works in every believer. Paul tells Philemon that he is sending Onesimus back, and in doing so is sending his very heart. He admits that he would have preferred to keep Onesimus with him to serve him in Philemon's place during his imprisonment for the gospel, but he did not want to do anything without Philemon's consent, so that Philemon's goodness might not be by compulsion, but of his own free will. Then Paul offers a theological perspective on the whole situation. He suggests that perhaps Onesimus was separated from Philemon for a while, so that Philemon might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but as more than a slave, as a beloved brother. This reframing is crucial. What looked like loss and betrayal, what seemed like a crime and a disaster, was actually God's providence working to bring about something better than what existed before. Onesimus left as a slave. He is returning as a brother. Paul makes his appeal personal and direct. He says that if Philemon considers Paul his partner, he should receive Onesimus as he would receive Paul himself. If Onesimus has wronged Philemon in any way or owes him anything, Paul offers to personally guarantee the debt. He writes, "Charge that to my account. I, Paul, write this with my own hand. I will repay it." Paul is willing to take on Onesimus's debt, to stand in his place, to ensure that Philemon suffers no financial loss from Onesimus's return. But then Paul adds a gentle reminder that subtly shifts the weight of obligation. He notes that he is not mentioning to Philemon that Philemon owes Paul his very self, his salvation, his spiritual life. The implication is clear. Philemon's debt to Paul is infinitely greater than any debt Onesimus might owe to Philemon. How can Philemon refuse Paul's request when he owes Paul everything? Paul expresses his confidence that Philemon will do even more than Paul asks. He is sure of Philemon's obedience, confident in his generous spirit. He even hints that he hopes to visit Philemon soon, adding a gentle pressure. Paul will see firsthand how Philemon responds to this situation. The letter concludes with greetings from Paul's companions and a benediction, but its work is done. Paul has made his case, appealed to Philemon's love, guaranteed Onesimus's debt, reminded Philemon of his own debt to Paul, reframed the situation in terms of God's providence, and expressed confidence in a positive outcome. We can imagine Onesimus carrying this letter on the long journey back to Colossae, over 1,000 miles on foot, retracing the steps of his flight, but this time moving toward reconciliation rather than away from judgment. Every step must have been filled with anxiety and hope in equal measure. Would Philemon honor Paul's request? Would he receive Onesimus as a brother? Or would he exercise his legal rights as a master to punish a runaway slave? The journey would have taken weeks, perhaps months. Onesimus had plenty of time to think, to pray, to wonder what awaited him. He was returning to the place he had fled, but he was not the same person who had left. He had encountered Christ. He had been transformed. He had served Paul faithfully. He carried a letter from an apostle vouching for him. But would it be enough? When Onesimus finally arrived in Colossae and presented himself to Philemon along with Paul's letter, the moment of truth arrived. Philemon read Paul's words, heard Onesimus' story, faced the decision Paul had laid before him. The letter does not tell us exactly what Philemon decided, but the fact that the letter was preserved and eventually included in the New Testament canon strongly suggests that the outcome was positive. Tradition holds that Philemon did indeed receive Onesimus as a brother, that reconciliation was achieved, that what was lost was found and restored. The story of Onesimus and Philemon operates on multiple levels. On the surface, it is about a runaway slave and his master, about a specific relationship that needed to be restored. But at a deeper level, it illustrates profound theological truths about what it means to be lost and found in Christ. Onesimus represents all of us in our rebellion against God. Like a runaway slave, we have fled from our rightful master, stolen what was not ours, sought to make our own way in a far country. We have been useless when we were created to be useful, unprofitable when we were meant to bear fruit, lost when we were meant to be found. But God, like Paul in this story, pursues us even in our lostness. He finds us in the far country of our rebellion. He shares the gospel with us. He transforms us, making us useful when we were useless, profitable when we were unprofitable, sons and daughters when we were slaves. Then comes the matter of reconciliation. We cannot simply stay in our new life and ignore the broken relationships of our past. We must return, must face what we have done, must seek reconciliation even when it is risky and frightening. But we do not return alone or empty-handed. We return with Christ's advocacy, with his guarantee of our debt, with his promise to pay what we cannot pay. Paul's role in the story mirrors Christ's role in our redemption. Just as Paul wrote to Philemon on Onesimus' behalf, pleading his case and guaranteeing his debt, Christ intercedes for us before the Father. Just as Paul offered to pay whatever Onesimus owed, Christ paid the debt we could never pay, taking our sin upon himself and crediting his righteousness to our account. Just as Paul sent Onesimus back not as a slave, but as a beloved brother, Christ reconciles us to the Father, not as slaves, but as sons and daughters, not as debtors, but as heirs. Philemon's decision mirrors the decision every person must make when confronted with someone who has wronged them, but who comes back transformed by Christ. Will we insist on our rights? Will we demand payment? Will we hold on to the old relationship of master and slave, creditor and debtor, wronged and wrongdoer? Or will we receive the person as a beloved brother or sister, forgiving as we have been forgiven, showing grace as we have been shown grace? The letter also speaks to the transforming power of the gospel on social structures. Slavery was an accepted institution in the ancient world, and Paul does not directly call for its abolition in this letter. But by insisting that Philemon receive Onesimus as a beloved brother, by placing them on equal footing in Christ, by making their relationship in the gospel more fundamental than their relationship in society, Paul plants a seed that would eventually undermine slavery itself. If there is neither slave nor free in Christ, if all are brothers and sisters, if the master and slave worship together as equals in the church, then the institution of slavery cannot ultimately stand. The gospel works like leaven, slowly but surely transforming everything it touches. The name Onesimus, meaning useful, takes on new significance in light of his story. He was named useful but became useless through his actions. Then, through his encounter with Christ and Paul, he became truly useful, living up to his name in a way he never had before. This reflects the journey of every believer. We are created for usefulness, for purpose, to bear fruit and glorify God. But sin makes us useless, turning us away from our created purpose. Then redemption restores us, makes us truly useful again, allows us to fulfill the purpose for which we were made. Paul's willingness to guarantee Onesimus's debt, to write "charge that to my account," is one of the most beautiful pictures of substitutionary atonement in all of Scripture. It is exactly what Christ has done for us. Our sin has created a debt we cannot pay, has wronged God in ways we cannot make right. But Christ steps in and says, "Charge that to my account, I will pay it." And because of who Christ is, because of the infinite value of his sacrifice, the debt is fully paid and we are reconciled. The joy that must have filled Onesimus's heart when Philemon received him as a brother, when he was restored not just to his old position, but to something infinitely better, echoes the joy we experience when we are reconciled to God. We return expecting judgment and receive welcome. We come back as slaves and are received as sons and daughters. We deserve condemnation but experience celebration. This is the scandal and the beauty of grace. The story also reminds us that reconciliation often requires intermediaries and advocates. Onesimus could not simply show up at Philemon's door and expect to be received. He needed Paul's letter, Paul's advocacy, Paul's willingness to stand between him and Philemon and guarantee his acceptance. Similarly, we need Christ as our advocate, our mediator, the one who stands between us and the Father and makes reconciliation possible. As this story concludes, we are left with the image of Onesimus, once lost and now found, once useless and now useful, once a slave and now a brother, restored to Philemon through the power of the gospel and the advocacy of Paul. It is a fitting culmination to our exploration of biblical narratives about being lost and found, because it brings together so many of the themes we have seen: the value of the individual, the cost of redemption, the joy of restoration, the transformation that occurs when the lost are found, and the role of advocates and intermediaries in bringing about reconciliation. Throughout these stories, we have seen a consistent pattern. God seeks the lost. He pursues them into far countries and dark corners. He pays whatever cost is necessary to bring them home. And when they are found, when they are restored, there is celebration, joy that cannot be contained, a party that all of heaven joins. We have met a younger son who squandered his inheritance and returned to find his father running to meet him. We have encountered a shepherd who left 99 sheep to search for one, carrying it home on his shoulders. We have journeyed with David as he brought the ark back to Jerusalem with dancing and celebration. We have watched Joseph reveal himself to his brothers and reconcile his family. We have seen a woman search her house for a lost coin and throw a party when she found it. And we have read Paul's letter pleading for Onesimus to be received as a beloved brother. Each story is unique, but all point to the same profound reality. Our God is a God who seeks and saves the lost. He is not content to let us remain in our lostness. He pursues us with a love that will not let us go. He pays whatever price is necessary to bring us home. And when we are found, when we return, when we are restored, the celebration in heaven is beyond anything we can imagine. These stories invite us to examine our own lives and ask where we fit into these narratives. Have we wandered like the prodigal son, finding ourselves in a far country of our own making, ready to return home? Are we lost like a sheep, unable to find our way back, needing a shepherd to search for us? Have we drifted into obscurity like the ark, needing to be brought back to our proper place at the center of things? Are we separated from family like Joseph and his brothers, needing reconciliation and restoration? Have we fallen into a dark corner like the lost coin, unable even to cry out, depending entirely on God's search? Or have we run away like Onesimus, needing an advocate to plead our case and make our return possible? Wherever we find ourselves in these stories, the message is the same. God is searching. He has not given up on us. He considers us valuable enough to pursue, precious enough to pay any price to redeem, beloved enough to celebrate when we are found. The invitation is always open. The Father is always watching the road. The shepherd is always calling. The woman is always searching. David is always ready to celebrate the return of God's presence. Joseph is always ready to embrace his brothers. Philemon is always being asked to receive the returning slave as a brother. And the joy, when the lost are found, is beyond measure. It is the joy of the Father embracing his Son, of the shepherd carrying his sheep home, of David dancing before the ark, of Joseph weeping on Benjamin's neck, of the woman calling her neighbours to celebrate, of Philemon receiving Onesimus as a brother. It is heaven's joy, the angel's joy, God's own joy over one sinner who repents. These are not just ancient stories from a distant past. They are living narratives that continue to unfold in every generation, in every life that moves from lostness to foundness, from alienation to reconciliation, from death to life. They are your story and my story, the story of every person who has ever been lost and found their way home, or rather, been found by the one who never stopped searching. As we rest in these truths, as we let these stories wash over us, we can release the fears and anxieties of our own lostness. Whether we have wandered far or simply drifted away, whether we are trapped and unable to help ourselves, or running from what we fear, whether we are separated from those we love or alienated from God himself, the message of these stories is consistent and clear. The search is on, the searcher is faithful, and the end of the story is restoration, reconciliation, celebration, and joy. The God who ran to meet the prodigal son is running toward you. The God who carried the sheep on his shoulders is ready to carry you home. The God who danced before the ark celebrates his presence with you. The God who reconciled Joseph to his brothers longs to reconcile you to himself and to others. The God who searched for the coin until he found it will not stop searching until you are found. The God who pleaded for Onesimus stands as your advocate, guaranteeing your debt, making your acceptance possible. You are not too far gone. You have not wandered too far. You are not too damaged, too dirty, too useless. You are valued, sought after, precious enough that all of heaven waits to celebrate your return. The door is open. The light is on. The table is set. The party is ready to begin. All that remains is for you to allow yourself to be found, to stop running or hiding or drifting, to respond to the voice that calls your name, to accept the embrace that awaits you. Rest now in these truths. Let the stories settle into your heart. Know that you are loved with a love that seeks, that pursues, that pays any price, that celebrates your return. You are not lost beyond finding. You are not broken beyond mending. You are not estranged beyond reconciliation. The God of the lost and found knows exactly where you are, and he is coming for you with joy in his heart and celebration in his plan. Sleep well, beloved. You are not lost. You are found. You are not forgotten. You are remembered. You are not alone. You are sought after, pursued, valued, and deeply, eternally loved. The stories we have explored tonight are not just about ancient shepherds and coins and wayward sons. They are about you. They are about a God who will never give up on you, who considers you worth every effort, every cost, every sacrifice. Rest in that love. Be held by that grace. Know that you belong to the God who seeks and finds and celebrates and never ever lets go.